I'd like now to go ahead and introduce Dr. Caplan to you. I first met Arthur
a long time
years ago now. 20 years ago when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And Arthur has been on the scene of American bioethics now for 3 decades plus now. He did his undergraduate degree at Brandeis and did his PhD in philosophy at Columbia. He has served at the Hastings Center up in New York and then on to the University of Pittsburgh and then off to the University of Minnesota, where he started the Center for Ethics up there, and then he went to the University of Pennsylvania, where I was very happy to work with him when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, their Center for Bioethics. Dr. Caplan is the Emanuel and Robert Hart Professor of Bioethics and the chair of the fairly newly created Department of Medical Ethics in the Medical School at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author or editor of 25 books and of over 500 papers in refereed journals of medicine, science, philosophy, bioethics, and health policy. He writes a regular column on bioethics for MSNBC.com, is a frequent guest commentator on National Public Radio, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other media outlets. I cannot underscore the assistance that Dr. Caplan has played for the American public in having the American public better understand the relevant issues in many of the ethical dilemmas of our time. And with that, I give you Dr. Arthur Caplan, who will now speak on the ethics and politics of stem cell research in the United States. Dr. Caplan.
The other computer. I don't know if my mic is on. Can you hear me through this thing? Is that working at all? This mic?
That was for the TV. Yeah.
I stuck one on me.
Yeah.
The other one?
That one is.
Right, and the other one is...
One's for the TV recording.
No, I know. But this one didn't fire up, I don't think.
Yeah, give about 2 seconds.
There we go. And you can just load whatever you need to on there while I'm talking. I don't mind if you're putzing around with that. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see Mark and David and Nancy and lots of other old friends, some of whom I have had the pleasure to work with or sometimes teach. And they've gone on and done some wonderful things at Louisville and certainly made a national reputation for what's been taking place here. My task is to cover the non-controversial subject of stem cell research. This is something that leads people to quick agreement and rapid consensus, and I'm alert to that. So I know that we're going to be going down a relatively contentious highway, but I hope you'll bear with me. I have some strong feelings and views about stem cell research. Let me give you a little bit of the geography here. I will tell you that I think embryonic stem cell research is ethical to pursue. I'll tell you that I think cloning for the pursuit of embryonic stem cells is worth doing and is ethical to pursue. I think some of the things that are going on here in terms of modifying embryo-like cells that have been found by researchers here, and some of the things that have been going on in terms of modifying pluripotent cells in animal models are ethical and worth pursuing as well. So I will tell you that the bottom line of these remarks will be that it's worth going across the board to pursue research in all areas of stem cell research. I will try and make a case that the core issue that we have to face is what to do with embryos, and are thinking about that. And I want to make 2 key points about thinking about embryos and possibly losing them or destroying them.
Arthur, 1 second. You need your
Oh, do you have your thumb drive?
Oh, you need that too?
Yeah.
Let's toss that in there. I have this really cool slide that I'm tap dancing to wait to show you. But I'm going to give you the conclusion so that you see where the arguments are going to go. One conclusion will be that if you are comfortable in doing in vitro fertilization, if that technology does not bother you in terms of being used to make babies, then I think a parallel moral case can be made that embryonic stem cell research is also got to be accepted as ethical, because in vitro fertilization, did you see it there? Involves, embryo destruction, and not more or less than you're going to see in embryonic stem cell research. And I'll try to make the case that some of the problems with embryonic stem cell research do require oversight and regulation, and more that has been done to date to achieve that, but that isn't going to happen unless we get to first base, which is allowing the idea that embryonic stem cell research is ethical. So I'm going to try and argue that it is ethical to do it. I'll take on some of the criticisms and objections that people have. One of the things I'm going to tell you about today is why I think that, or I'm going to say something about what I think the moral status of an embryo is. So what you're going to get in this lunch talk is, in my opinion, unbelievable. In an hour, you're going to get an argument for why embryonic stem cell research is ethical. I'm going to resolve the question of when life begins. I'm going to tell you what the moral status of the embryo is. I'm going to tell you how to regulate this research. And I'm sure there will be no questions at the end. All right. Here's the cool map. This cool map was made up by a friend of mine at the University of Minnesota, Bill Hoffman. And he's got a little input from me in doing it, but the map addresses a key thing that everybody in the room should understand if you don't take home any other message from today. The issue of embryonic stem cell research and cloning for stem cell research is not one of whether it should be done, but where it's going to be done, because there are places in the world that will do it. So, on the map, the countries that have the most tolerant, if you will, or liberal policy, most accepting policy about embryonic stem cell research, including allowing cloning as a technique to generate embryonic stem cells, are in the darkest brown shade. So China and India and Britain and Sweden and Finland and South Africa are all places where you can do all forms of embryonic stem cell research. And there are teams at work in all those places. Obviously, as we know from the headlines, which I'll say something about in a minute, Korea is also up there too, South Korea. Not quite as open to certain forms of stem cell research, but nonetheless allowing embryonic stem cell research in various ways, and you'll see what that is later in terms of where the stem cells can come from embryos. Russia, Canada, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, France, many other countries, Iran, are going to allow certain forms of embryonic stem cell research. Up on the map, if you look carefully, there's that cross-hatched part of the United States, California. They have laws that allow embryonic stem cell research to proceed with funding, and I might add cloning, but some of their debate is held up right now under challenges to a state initiative that passed there. And if we look at an American map, which I didn't bring you, New Jersey, Delaware, Massachusetts, Connecticut have all passed legislation allowing some forms of embryonic stem cell research, but are not funding it. They're just saying it can be done, explicitly allowing it to be done, but no funding. So there are many parts of the world where embryonic stem cell research is being done every day. There are some parts of the world where cloning to try and identify or create embryonic stem cells is also being done every day. And so, again, the debate in part is not whether it's going to be done, but whether it should be done in the United States, and if so, what restrictions might we want to put on embryonic stem cell research. And a kind of background question is, if things happen in other countries, and somebody does find something of therapeutic use, would we allow it to come to the United States? We might say we won't allow embryonic stem cell research, we won't allow cloning for the purposes of creating stem cells to be done here. We might say there's no government funding of it here, but if the Chinese or the Indians or the Brits discover something that looks therapeutic in terms of transplanting modified cells, would we say that it is prohibited or you must go there to get access to those treatments? And part of my bringing that up is I don't believe that that would happen here, that we would prohibit people from gaining access to cell lines or modified cell lines or curative transplants of embryonic stem cells derived from embryos. I don't think we prohibit those things from being brought in here. So that raises the moral question, if you oppose embryonic stem cell research, are you opposed to doing the research? Are you opposed to allowing people to gain access to the therapies? What's the policy going to be across the board? And it isn't enough to simply say, I don't think it should be done with government money here, because that map makes it clear that there are some other policy questions, moral questions that have to be addressed. Even if you don't want it done with government money here, would you prohibit it from being available to Americans if something happens somewhere else? That's the coolest slide I've got. The rest of them degenerate back to kind of boring PowerPoint. Little science moment here just to get everybody on the same page. There are three kinds of stem cells. The controversy tends to focus on the embryonic. There are things that can be argued about for the other two, and I want to just spend a minute reminding you. Cells that are in your body naturally that repair and make only the same kind of cell are called unipotent stem cells. So sperm stem cells make more sperm in male testes. They are a kind, the cells in the testes that make sperm cells are a kind of unipotent stem cell. They can and will someday be very controversial. They aren't yet, but they will be, because one way to try and modify things in offspring is to genetically alter sperm-making stem cells. And there are a number of groups around the world that are interested in that. We have a group at the veterinary school at Penn that is very interested in that. They're interested in it not because they want to make super babies. They're interested because they want to make super pigs, cows, sheep, and goats. That's what interests them. They don't see much money in trying to tweak human genes yet, but they see a lot of money in being able to modify the sperm-making cells in those other animals and then making more milk or meat or cheese or whatever they want to make from those animals. There are some other cells that we're familiar with that exist in our bodies. Certain types of skin cells repair cuts and so forth and grow back the same types of cells. So there's some wear and tear stuff that we have where we already have adult stem cells that have the power to regenerate, more of the same. There are also some pluripotent cells in our bodies, bone marrow being one that is well known, that can make different types of cells within a category. So bone marrow makes different types of blood cells. Naturally, in adults, fetal tissues from placentas and umbilical cords can make multiple types of cells. People have recently found, and believe they found, some slow-acting cardiac and nerve cells. The problem there is, right now we don't know how to grow those so that they work very fast. So the heart may do some repair after a heart attack. The spinal cord may do some repair after an injury, but whatever's going on is way too slow right now for things to grow back in any useful way for the injured party. There's work going on at Louisville actually to try and, particularly in that cardiac area, to see what you could do maybe to speed that up or make more cells. But those are models that do exist. They're important to keep in mind throughout my talk because they're often brought forward as alternatives to embryonic stem cell research. And to some extent, they are alternatives. That is to say, there are certain models here that might be interesting to see whether you could get pluripotent cells to be even more capable of generating different types of cells than they are naturally. And that is a strategy that certainly some people have pursued. And ironically, for those of you who are groupies of the stem cell issue, not only was there a Korean announcement of fraud about cloning for stem cell research, there's also been a Korean announcement of fraud that kind of got lost about using adult stem cells on persons with spinal cord injury to help them walk again that hasn't panned out, and I'll say more about that later. So there are different groups who are trying to pursue adult and fetal stem cell sources. That's great. That's a very interesting thing to do. As I said, if you're going to try and pursue modification of sperm-making cells, that might raise some ethical issues applied to humans. We haven't heard much about that, probably should. And if you're making adult stem cells or pluripotent stem cells, somebody somewhere is going to drive the IRB here at Louisville crazy, we can all hope, in a few years, if, let's say, somebody wants to try cardiac muscle repair and wants to go to phase 1 or early phase 1 trials. That's an ethics issue. When are you ready to try it in humans? If you have someone with a massively damaged heart who's trying to live on an LVAD and is begging for some way to get off, and a team here says, you know, we might be able to inject myoblast into you and have the heart repair itself and grow back. That sounds pretty good. When is it ready for prime time? How much animal work has to be done? How do you balance the patient's desire, the subject's desire to get off technology and to save their life against whether the science is ready? Those are emerging ethical issues. We can all hope that they arise. That would be a great thing to have to argue about these, but they will come. And so even in the adult stem cell or pluripotent stem cell areas, you're not going to get away from all the ethical issues. There will also be questions about access. There will be questions about ownership, licensing, patents, control of all this technology. So there's more to be said about stem cell research than just what to do about embryos. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about embryos. But there are other things out there looming around. Just keep that in mind, too. So just to recap, where stem cell research gets done is the issue, not whether, including embryonic and cloning. A policy question that's in the background already is, are you going to prohibit people from bringing in technology developed overseas? Remember, many of our large pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca, for example, is funding embryonic stem cell research in other countries, but they have all kinds of operations in this country. So they will be eager, if they find something in Britain, to sell it here, for example. So that's what I'm talking about when I say there is going to be an issue if things work. They may not, but if they did, of who's going to get access here. And there are certainly a number of ethical questions raised by adult stem cell research. It's not that that is an ethically neutral or uncontroversial area. Many forms of adult stem cell manipulation, like sperm cells, will raise very tough questions about what to use it for, who to use it on, and hopefully, if people move forward in adult and pluripotent stem cell research, we will be faced with when to start human trials questions, which are things that it would be useful to start thinking about now. So the other category is totipotent, and that's the embryo. And the embryo, as we know, has this stem cell in it that was discovered by researchers in Wisconsin at Johns Hopkins in 1998. It hasn't been identified for a long time. There are occasionally people who will say the following: adult stem cell research has led to many cures, and embryonic has led to none. Therefore, why don't we just put our money into adult? That makes sense, but it has a weird view of history. The first bone marrow transplants from adult to adult have been done, indeed, since the 60s. There have been non-related and fetal source bone marrow transplants for decades. That's true. But the embryonic stem cell was only found less than 8 years ago, and there hasn't been much money to do work with it. So it isn't really fair to compare embryonic stem cell work to adult stem cell work, even though it is true that adult stem cells have led and occasioned cures, and no one has cured anybody with an embryonic stem cell transplant of any sort. That little stem cell in the embryo has to turn into all the body tissues. It makes people very eager to be able to manipulate it, and what they're thinking about is being able to pour chemicals on stem cells taken out of embryos in dishes and trying to trick them into growing cells that are of biological use. Nerve cells, which don't grow very well, heart muscle cells, certain types of insulin-producing cells, islet cells, and so on. So the idea is, we know that they have the ability to become everything. Maybe we can trick them into becoming cell lines that we want if we get there very early. Sometimes I'm asked, doesn't this mean that if you want to do embryonic stem cells, you're going to have to grow embryos or fetuses and harvest them? It doesn't, because the totipotency of the embryo only lasts about 4 cell divisions. After that, you're into fetal cells, and you're back to doing kinds of pluripotent work. So no one who's interested in embryonic stem cell research is going to be incubating anything for very long in a dish. If you want to get an embryonic stem cell, you have to get there very early before there's differentiation. Remove it. Even if you're there within a few days, it's too late. So this is not a technology that involves harvesting fetuses for stem cells, as sometimes appears in these arguments. Nonetheless, it does involve embryo destruction. Now let me remind you, there has been a little history here. One thing that happened is that Dolly, the sheep, got cloned in February of 1997, and so some of the issues around embryonic stem cell research have been tied into cloning. Why are people interested in cloning? There's a very simple reason that cloning has been sort of a holy grail of embryonic stem cell research. If you could take DNA from your own body cells and put it in an egg from which you've removed the genome, and get that cloned Dolly-style entity to start to grow, you should be able to harvest back cell lines, if you can figure out how to manipulate them, that are matched to your own DNA. So if you can grow your own stem cells by cloning from your own biological material, there will be no rejection. If you're using embryos made from other people's gametes, they will be biologically different than you, and you are going to be faced with the challenge of rejection. So, the allure of cloning, everybody follow this, is to make your own spare part cells that are biologically identical to you. Embryonic stem cells may be totipotent, but they're genetically different, and that raises an additional management issue about trying to put them into a recipient. If they're biologically different, they're going to be treated as foreign tissue, kind of like getting invaded by a virus or a bacteria, and the body's natural defense systems will go after those cells. You're going to have to manage that. So cloning for stem cells has always been of interest, the most interest, because of this aspect of being able to get around the problem of rejection. Adult stem cells have the problem of rejection too. If you can use your own, if you could grow heart muscle cells from your own heart muscle, well, that's great. But if you need to take bone marrow from somebody else and transplant it to you, that's a problem. That's a problem with adult stem cell transplants. We've got to manage rejection again. So, as some of you in the room know, there can be acute rejections, chronic rejections, graft versus host disease problems, or just infections because you're using drugs to tune down the immune system, and that raises problems for the recipient. So, cloning is in the picture here because of that, but some of the baggage of cloning is also in the picture because people have been afraid that if you allowed cloning to generate stem cells, that you might see people on the side secretly try to use it to produce people. That is to say, if we don't stop cloning for research, then we might see cloning for reproduction. So if we don't get a handle on this, there could be clones moving into your neighborhood made by seedy entrepreneurs. Now I happen to think that this whole area, and I'm happy to talk about this in question and answer, is loony. That's a technical ethics term we use a lot. And the reason it's loony is, as Professor Wang found out from Korea, it's very hard to make human embryonic stem cells from cloned human embryos, because it's hard to make cloned human embryos. And as primatologists have been finding out, it's very hard to clone primates. Not every animal species is clonable. There have been a number that people have been trying on and have not succeeded. Dogs, for example. It isn't self-evident that whatever happens when someone tries to clone a human embryo creates something that can produce an adult human being. And you all know the data, I think, on animal cloning. Probably to make Dolly, the odds were 1 in 400, but even the best, easiest to clone animals, which turn out to be goats, probably still take about 1 in 100 efforts. So trying to make 100 cloned embryos, you only get 1 viable adult. That's why we don't hear much about the use of cloning yet in agriculture. It's very impractical, too many deaths, too many stillborns, too much expense, too many animals that you have to get pregnant and monitor. It's not practical yet. There is no reason to believe quite yet that human beings could be reproduced by cloning. There just isn't. I know the Raelians announce periodically that they have a baby. that cult that runs around in the Starfleet uniforms. And every once in a while, someone not far from here, like Panos Zavos, will announce that he's going to clone people, which he's been doing for many years now, but there don't seem to be any results. And I remember my friend Dr. Antorini in Italy said, well, he wouldn't be stopped from cloning people. He was going to do it on a boat offshore, outside the international legal limits in the open seas. No one could stop him. Well, you think about it. If you want to try to do human cloning outside of research, you're going to need a very big boat, because you're probably going to need hundreds of women to donate their eggs, hundreds of women to be the surrogate mothers, lots of neonatologists and OBGYNs to handle the miscarriages and the overgrowths, and then people to try and rescue whatever gets born. So it'll be a big, big boat, probably not easy to miss, sailing around in the open seas. There won't be much in the way of secretive reproductive cloning going on anytime soon. So the reason I'm sneering at this is one of the first things that we did was we banned all human cloning in the House of Representatives here in July 2001. It wasn't really in response to the stem cell discovery, it was in response to Dolly. The Senate has not followed with that. That bill will come back. Senator Brownback is going to bring that bill back in the Senate this spring, and efforts are underway to ban all forms of human cloning, basically driven by that fear that if we don't do it, there are going to be people created by cloning. We can argue, if you want to get into this, about whether that's bad or dangerous, but I don't think it's going to work. That's my point. So I'm not that worried about allowing research cloning, sliding down a slippery slope and turning into reproductive cloning. George Bush, in the first public speech he gave after being elected in his first term on August 9, 2001, was wrestling with this problem, and he announced a compromise. David Dukas tells me that one of his theological guideposts is the source of this compromise. I don't know if that's true or not. David sometimes overextends his descriptions, but whether it's true or not, it is interesting that the president himself has gone on saying he is not against embryo stem cell research, he is against embryo destruction. And he has allowed, since August 9, 2001, the use of stem cell lines that were already in existence at that point in time for federally funded research. So he said that there were 60 stem cell lines around, that they could be used, but he didn't want to see any more embryos destroyed to make any new stem cell lines. That's interesting because morally the president's position is that if embryos are already destroyed, then they're illicit as a source of stem cell lines. Of course, that's part of the argument that's going to come up here, whether we're already destroying other kinds of embryos in other contexts. Remember my little allusion to the in vitro fertilization clinic. And if that's so, then it becomes a little harder to see why, if you accept the idea of embryo destruction and the generation of stem cell lines in one area, you wouldn't accept it in a parallel area. And the Bush policy already does. One problem is that there aren't 60 existing stem cell lines. There are probably no more than about 6 or 7 viable stem cell lines. I don't know where that 60 number came from. As soon as it appeared, I was running around on TV and writing in newspapers saying, there aren't 60 stem cell lines. Everybody I talk to says they're not there. One reason they're not there, if you remember my map, some of the 60 stem cell lines existed in India and Sweden, and they won't give them to us. They want to work on them themselves. So that's been a restriction. And then some of the other stem cell lines have burnt out or weren't fertile, didn't grow right. So in essence, you can follow the Bush policy and say, use the ones that already existed, but no more stem cell destruction. But in fact, that's not going to allow for any further research to proceed if that's the restriction, because those stem cell lines don't work. Everybody follow that? So we've got a bunch of stem cell lines that were supposed to be out there. They're not out there. They don't work very well. That's not going to be a place to do embryonic stem cell research in any serious way. Canada, by the way, has chosen to ban cloning for reproduction and research, but it is allowing stem cell research from spare embryos, which I'll explain in a minute. The United Nations wrestled with the issue of what to do about cloning and basically put out a recommendation against cloning for reproduction and research, but didn't mandate it. And as I think you know, Korea announced that they had made cloned human embryos and gotten stem cell lines from them in February of 2004. Let me jump up to, just in the interest of time, this is what the Koreans said they did. that they had gotten embryonic stem cells to grow from human beings who had different diseases, 11 male and female patients. This was the paper in Science that appeared last March. And they said basically using the Dolly technique of nuclear transfer, they'd obtained eggs, they'd taken out the DNA from these eggs, they had dropped in genetic material from 11 different people with 11 different kinds of diseases and produced growing viable stem cell lines 11 times. And in the report, they said that they had done this basically using about 25 embryos and, 25 eggs, and made it happen from 11 different sources. Just to pat myself on the back here, I was always a little skeptical of this because that would be the most efficient ratio of cloning seen in any animal species. No animal species has had a 50% success rate, certainly not from 11 different sources growing viable stem cell lines out. So I was always impressed that they had achieved what animal cloners had not achieved in any animal species. Remember the numbers in Dolly, 1 in 400, the numbers in the goats are 1 in 100, but these guys reported that they had done it at a 50% batting average and had good stem cell lines growing out from 11 different biological sources. So that seemed to me, and that's why the scientific world was so excited. It looked like they had gotten a breakthrough, were jumping ahead almost exponentially the pace at which anybody else could do things. But as you know, back in back in November, just a couple months ago, Dr. Wang was accused first of getting those eggs that you have to use to clone things from his lab assistants. And that's a big ethical no-no, basically because it's hard to imagine somebody working as a lab assistant, as a woman, really giving a true voluntary consent when their boss comes and says, I think we need some eggs, and I think you're the source. Do you want to do it? So the first thing that got him in trouble was the revelation that his egg donors for cloning to get the cells back here to insert into the DNA donated from these 11 people, that the egg donors were not necessarily donors. Well, it turned out that they weren't, and that they had not really had a lot of choice about the matter, and it turned out, too, that Wang himself admitted that he had paid some people to supply eggs, as well as getting them from his lab assistants. So that was problematic. Then, some of his colleagues began to hint that maybe he didn't have any stem cell lines at all. And basically whistleblowers within his own lab began to challenge the idea that he had really done what he had said he had done. By December, his colleague here in the United States who had worked with him asked to be taken off his science paper. Other of his colleagues were saying that many of the cell lines were faked, and then the government appointed a panel there in South Korea, and they basically found that everything was fraudulent. He had no stem cell lines at all. So he has now quit his position. The South Korean government is promising much tougher oversight. They had spent about $120 million to support Wang in his efforts. And critics of embryonic stem cell research have been jumping all over this fraud as illustrative of the moral bankruptcy of the entire field of embryonic stem cell research. Now remember, cloning for stem cell research is one piece of a much broader strategy to do embryonic. We mentioned earlier, cloning is attractive because it solves the problem of rejection if you can make things from your own cells. But there are many people, and most of the countries on that map are not doing cloning for stem cell research. They're using embryos to produce stem cells. So, whatever Dr. Wang was up to, Professor Wang was up to, or not up to, as the case may be, it isn't an indictment of the whole field of embryonic stem cell research if he lied. As I pointed out, there has been a fraud recently revealed. Somebody had announced, and it was touted frequently as an alternative to embryonic stem cell research, that they had used adult stem cells to help people walk in Korea. And it turns out now that none of those people walked, and most of them are sick or worse off post their adult stem cell transplant into their spinal cord. These were people with paralysis. But none of the critics are calling for a suspension of work on adult stem cell research. And there was an announcement just this week, just to give an example, a guy published in the New England Journal and in the Lancet articles about ways to treat oral cancer that were completely fabricated. I don't think we're going to close down oral cancer research because of this guy's fraud. So it is bogus to argue that because Dr. Wang is a phony and basically engaged in fraud, that shows the entire area is wrong. And to put it another way, what the critics don't seem to understand is that fraud is something that individuals do. It is not something that deprecates an entire field of research. If you really believe that fraud should bring areas of research to an end, then geology, paleontology, psychology would all have to stop because they historically have had massive frauds. Cyril Burt made up all his IQ data. You'd have to shut down all that area of work. Piltdown Man and many other notorious frauds have been hoaxed on people around the world, but they were not used to set back the field. They became terrible, immoral, and despicable instances. Even Wang's research is despicable because it raised hopes on the part of people that cures were coming, but it doesn't set back the field. There are plenty of other people doing work that are going to continue doing it. Fraud is something, if you will, that adheres to a person, not to a field. So let's get to the embryos and put cloning for research, the Korean fiasco aside for the time being, although I can tell you in China, India, Britain, and Sweden, people are all now thinking, well, if Wang didn't get there first, maybe I can. So they're cloning away to see what they can do, although it turns out no results so far. It's hard to do it. Let me give you a little aside here, just since you've been nice enough to spare a lunch hour. Why did Wang think he could pull this off? That's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I have a theory. I'm not sure it's right, but I'll tell it to you. I think that what Wang felt was if he announced, remember Wang is a legitimate scientist. He has done cloning work in animals. He's a veterinarian who's done cloning. I think he thought he was going to get beaten out by teams from China or Britain or someplace else to be the first to successfully clone human embryos and get stem cells from them. I think he thought the competition was breathing down his back. If he announced that he had done it and claimed to have this breakthrough, he certainly could produce a paper showing a technique that would be plausible to people, and then he would hope very hard that actually someone else in Britain or China did do it. Then they would, in fact, be announcing a confirmation of his breakthrough. No one would challenge that he had been there first because it was plausible that he had done it, and so he gambled that a second team somewhere would reproduce his results. In fact, they would be getting there first, and where he went wrong was it turned out to not be so easy to clone human embryos. So he made the announcement, no one else replicated. His own team began to say, where the hell are these stem cell lines that you say you made? He got in trouble for his egg donation practices, and he was left hanging and twisted in the wind because no announcements came from anywhere. So it may turn out to be very tough to generate stem cell lines from cloned human embryos. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it may be very hard, and I think that's what did Wang in. He bet on it being easy. Turned out to be difficult. So I think he got stuck. He sort of hoped that someone else would do it too, and then he would just be lauded as the breakthrough guy because no one would ever challenge. More likely that stem cell lines are going to come out of embryos, and that's where, as I said, the focus of the ethics that I want to talk about for the remainder of my remarks goes. Well, is there a strong ethical case against embryonic stem cell research using embryos? Not cloned ones, just embryos. Some people believe there is. One argument is that destroying an embryo is wrong. It's just unethical. Why? Because embryos are persons from the moment they're created, some people believe. That's a strong pro-life position, that from conception, a person exists. Secondly, embryos deserve respect. Some people argue that, and it's wrong to destroy them, always. Some people would say destroying an embryo is the equivalent of killing an adult human being. It's murder, and that's wrong. So some people just oppose embryo destruction because they think of the act as being one of killing or murder, that it is wrong to destroy life. A kind of variant argument is that those who favor embryonic stem cell research sometimes say, well, you know, you can benefit people in wheelchairs or who are, have impaired heart function, or maybe help people with nerve damage regrow nerves and so forth, or Parkinson patients regrow parts of their brain that make chemicals that are requisite for movement and motion. But one response to that is killing to save a life or help someone is always wrong. We don't go out and kill people to get their organs, even though people need kidneys and hearts and livers for transplant. And we shouldn't go out and kill embryos, even if you're going to do it for a noble purpose. So a variant argument is, yes, it's killing, but it's serving a useful goal. So that argument is also one that people believe makes the case against embryonic stem cell research. Another argument, which I've already told you about 50 times, is there are other ways to proceed. We don't need to do embryonic stem cell research. We can do adult stem cell research. My argument about that is maybe we can, maybe we can't. We don't know. We don't know what's going to work. Right now, the optimism about that Korean helping the people who are paralyzed walk again by putting adult stem cells into their spinal cords is a dismal, fraudulent failure. So they've had a failure on that end of the street too. There must be a lesson here about be cautious about Korean stem cell announcements, whether they're about clones or cloned embryonic stem cells or adult stem cells. But whatever the problem there, it isn't clear that what line of research is going to work the best. And if you have a kid who's a type 1 diabetic, or if you are sitting in a wheelchair, as many people have told me, they would like to see all avenues of research pursued. And that's my position. I don't know what's going to work. There's nothing that's clearly an alternative. Nothing, we're too early in trying to do stem cell research to know whether we can make unipotent cells pluripotent, pluripotent cells totipotent, or make totipotent cells from embryos pluripotent or unipotent, coming the other way. What does it take to control what's going on? We don't know. We're at the Wilbur and Orville Wright flight stage of embryonic stem cell research. We don't know what we're doing. And in adult stem cell manipulation, we're about in the same place. So I wouldn't call anything an alternative to anything right now. I think you have to put bets across the board as the prudent strategy if you want to look for stem cell therapies. The last argument is embryonic stem cell research doesn't work at all. It's all hype. It's overpromised. That's spinning out of the announcement of the fraud in Korea. I would simply say it isn't old enough to be hyped. I mean, there has been some hype. People have been trying to get the research done, and in the context of an argument about whether it's wrong to kill embryos, some people do get excited and start to talk about if we could only do this research, people will be out of their wheelchairs and no one will suffer from Parkinsonism. I've heard those statements. That is hype-like, but it's just rhetoric in a heated debate. So I don't think there's any evidence that embryonic stem cell research won't work at all. It's not all hype. There are a lot of legitimate scientists doing it who think that they can make it work. So it's the critics who think it's hype. A lot of the scientific proponents do not. So what I want to do is review these arguments and see whether they hold up. This takes us into the promised resolution of something that many of you may have puzzled about. What is an embryo? And what is its moral status? Is it a person, a human being, a human life, a living thing, a possible person, a potential person, or a blueprint for a potential person? I tend to think what it is something on the lower end of that list, not the higher end. So we can use a model. If we think of an acorn as an embryo-like entity, and we think of an oak tree as an adult, do we want to say that an oak tree that's destroyed by lightning is the same loss as if an acorn is eaten by a squirrel? Are they morally equivalent? Is it really the case that potentiality to become a tree is the same thing as a tree? I can put this example to you in another way. If you were going to the in vitro fertilization program, one of the ones in the state here, and there was a fire, and you could turn left and go to the neonatal unit and save premature babies, or turn right and go to save embryos that are frozen in tanks, which way do you turn? Do you flip a coin? I don't think so. I think we would be very angry if the rescue teams or the fire department didn't save the babies as opposed to the embryos frozen in the tanks. There is a moral difference between possibility and potentiality and actuality. It's an old one in religious traditional thinking. I think it is a mistake to confuse the idea that possible people, which are what embryos are the same as actual people. But there's even some scientific reason to think that that's true. And I want to jump over here. Look at the third thing down there. The natural failure rate of embryos. What I'm talking about is, some of you may be familiar with this, sex. Just seeing if you're alert out there. Somewhere in the talk you have to mention sex, and then people, well, if you decided to go make an embryo in your spare time in the back seat of a car, or your bedroom, or some other place, it turns out that about half of the embryos that are made have some abnormality. We know, in fact, that the older you are as a male or a female, the abnormality rate goes out, because we see embryos in people that don't become babies. It's called an infertility problem. There are women in their late 30s and early 40s who have extra chromosomes, and you can see them through genetic analysis, and you know that those embryos can't become babies. They are suffering, if you will, from miswiring problems. They are absolutely unable to become babies. That's why the women can't have children. That's why they may need an egg donor from a younger woman. There are other anomalies that beset embryos, and we're starting to be able to identify some of them. Why do I mention this? As an empirical fact, all life begins at conception. Not every conception begins a life. There are embryos that are miswired. To bolster my claim that embryos are potential people, there are some embryos that don't have any potential at all. The failure rate of embryos post-sexual intercourse, depending on who you read, is somewhere between 30 and 60%. This may horrify those of you who thought the world was getting overpopulated at a fast clip. It could be worse. A lot of embryos don't work. They fall out of the woman's body within the first month. She doesn't notice. If you want to say it this way, there's a spontaneous abortion, but it's not detected. No one really knew it happened. And the failure rate is very high. If those of you are interested, I'm happy to send you the literature that's come out recently on failure rates. It's a little hard to establish this because it's hard to take a normal population and track clinical pregnancies and see which ones don't eventuate. But there is work on it now. It's pretty high. So, to repeat, a lot of embryos are created, but they don't become fetuses, much less babies. I'm not even talking about stillbirths and other problems. Why scientists haven't engaged the debate about when life begins with some of the facts that we know from embryology, I don't know. But what I will tell you is this. If you believe that every embryo is potentially a person, that is factually false. Some can't become anything. They're completely chromosomally wrong. And others can't. We're not able to tell which ones. But the failure rate, if you're conservative, is 30%. So it isn't the same to say I'm an embryo in a dish versus I'm an embryo that's properly wired, implanted, and starting to grow and is going to make it to term. There is a lot of failure out there naturally. Ironically, that's why in vitro fertilization or fertility treatment is so hard. The failure rate in nature is very high. The rates that you see at the best clinics, and they've hovered at this rate now for 10 years, are around 20% success. That's a good performance at an in vitro fertilization clinic, making embryos outside the body and putting them back in. They're not doing as good as nature, but they're not that far off. An 80% failure rate with people who are older, who have gametes that are damaged, isn't bad when the natural failure rate is between 30 and 60%. So, to come back to that argument, just to show it to you again, is destroying an embryo always wrong? Are they persons from the minute conception occurs? I don't believe that they are. They're potential or possible, and sometimes they're not even that. Is it murder to kill an embryo, to pull a stem cell out of it? I don't believe that is the right description. It is destroying it, but it is not killing it. I think that's a description of what we do to other people, so you may lose potential. It's also biologically incorrect to say that you're going to be killing an embryo if it's in a dish, because there the potential hasn't even actualized at all. It hasn't implanted anywhere. Taking embryos in dishes is not something that's going to be a way, I think, to be described as murder. So I'm not buying this argument. I don't think it's sound. It's not killing. There aren't alternatives right now. It's not overly hyped. And the question is it worth it to lose possible potential in an embryo to try and do research that might help people with real diseases and ailments? That's the appropriate trade-off question. Some may still say no, but I would argue it isn't correct to phrase it as killing embryos to help others. It's the possibility of losing potential versus actuality of disease. Personally, that's a moral trade-off I would make. That's one I find ethically acceptable. That's why I think there is an ethical case for doing embryonic stem cell research. Let me, again, so we have some time here for questions, although, as I said, I doubt that there will be any. I want to point out one other thing. This document is President Bush's policy on something that was in the newspaper here yesterday. Anybody read that article about embryo adoption? So some people have said, look, I hear that people say that there are embryos that are made every day and embryos are being destroyed every day. So I've told you why I think it's morally acceptable to destroy an embryo because it's only a possible or potential, if that, form of human life. But let's go further. If you're making babies at the in vitro fertilization clinic, you have to make many more embryos than you're going to get babies because you're only going to work about 1 in 5. 20% of the time you get a child. So clinics overproduce embryos in hoping that they're going to be able to make babies for couples or women or whoever wants to have a child. Right now in the United States, there are probably 400,000 frozen embryos. They got there because people were lucky and had babies and didn't want the embryos anymore that they'd made. Sometimes they're there because people ran out of money or gave up hope and didn't want the embryos that they had made. Sometimes they're there because the people who made them died. Sometimes they're there because the people who made them divorced. Sometimes they're there because the people who made them basically abandoned them and said we don't care about them anymore. Clinics every day destroy some of those embryos. If you make embryos in dishes to help infertile couples have children, you are going to have embryo destruction. The process of freezing and unfreezing an embryo causes the destruction of half of the embryos. There's no way to defrost an embryo without losing half of them. If you're going to allow fertility treatment, you're going to have destroyed embryos. So this is the second part of my argument. Part one, embryos are not people. They're potential or possible. They're not the same as adult people. Part two, embryo destruction is a part of infertility treatment. It is inevitable that you overproduce them. It is inevitable that people leave them behind. It is inevitable that when you defrost them, you're going to kill some of them. The president is not opposed to IVF. No one is calling for the closure of in vitro fertilization clinics because of embryo destruction. The purpose of making babies seems morally licit as a basis for having to tolerate a certain amount of overproduction of embryo and embryo loss. And I might add, if you really want to get crazy about this, really loony, you'd have to oppose sex because of what I told you about embryo loss after heterosexual intercourse. You're going to, if you deliberately set out, if you're not drunk, if you consciously set out to say, tonight we will make a baby, you're risking embryo destruction. I'll leave you to ponder the politics of trying to be opposed to that. The president has said, and this is his statement that came out last year, that he thinks embryo adoption is a better alternative than using some of those frozen embryos in research. And all I'm going to say about that is, with 400,000 frozen embryos, there's a lot of adopting that's going to have to be done. Worse, if you think about it even more, if you want to have a child, do you want to adopt an embryo from an infertile couple? If you're an infertile couple, do you want to give your embryo to somebody else to have a child? A lot of couples don't. That they're possessive, if you will. If I can't have a baby, I'm certainly not going to let some other couple have my baby. The chance of using embryo adoption, and I don't have time to read this thing, the idea that you can promote it as an alternative to what to do with all those frozen embryos is silly. There are too many of them. It's not the place that most people would want to go to get an embryo if they're having trouble having a child. They don't want to adopt one from a couple that's having trouble having a child. A lot of the embryos that are frozen, by the way, I didn't even get into this, are put aside because they don't look right to the embryologist. So it isn't the place where you're going to solve this by adoption. That's what the article was about in the Courier Journal yesterday. There have been children born through embryo adoption, that's true. There are about 100, but 100 relative to 400,000 leaves a lot of embryos that aren't going anyplace. So my argument is that's a source, a morally legitimate source of embryos for stem cell research. You could donate them at the IVF clinic and say, the ones we don't want, I donate to research. Or you could take the 400,000, most of which have been abandoned, and instead of just letting them sit there, you could decide to put them into research. That's a public policy issue we could argue about. But there are embryos available that we could use for research. You could offer them for adoption first, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But most of them won't be, and I think you have a place here where there's going to be embryo destruction anyway. So you're not doing anything that you wouldn't normally do. So let me get to the bottom line of my remarks, just to recap. There are a lot of places in the world, you can bring the lights up to it if you're still up there. There are a lot of places in the world where embryonic stem cell research and cloning for stem cell research is going on. It will continue to go on. The public policy question that we face is it going to go on here? Is it going to go on here with public money? You're going to show me where that button is, aren't you? Is it going to go on with public funds or not? Some parts of the country, California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, possibly Maryland, New Jersey, Delaware, are going to allow some forms of stem cell research to proceed. They may not be putting state money into it like California does, but they are. So, to a certain extent, the argument, in a way, is over. Nothing that took place, nothing in the Korean cloning scandal is an argument against pursuing more efforts to clone stem cells or to do overall embryonic stem cell research. I don't think embryonic stem cell research is all hype, but there's no guarantee it will work. It's research. So that's true. It may not pan out. The moral case, though, is really about embryos. What I tried to argue today is, look, one issue that faces us is, what is the moral status of an embryo? I don't think embryos are the same as people. My position is an embryo is possibility, is potentiality. Many embryos don't even have those features. As long as they're kept in dishes, none of them do. That is, they're not going to become anything. They require interactivity with implantation into a mother's womb and that interactivity of communication and chemical communication to have that potentiality actualized. Embryo loss is a fact of life. If you oppose it, if you really say I'm against embryo destruction, you have to oppose infertility treatment because it goes on all the time. Politically, I don't see any movement that way because it wouldn't be very popular to oppose it in that setting. So that's why we don't see it. Ironically, part of infertility treatment creates embryos that we might be able to use as sources for research. And you don't need 400,000 embryos. You could probably get by doing a lot of research with 500 embryos. Most of the frozen ones are going to be destroyed. They're not going to be adopted. It is dishonest to present that as an alternative policy of what to do with spare embryos. And, as I said, some clinics, I know this from studies we've done, are destroying embryos that aren't wanted anymore anyway. So there is embryo destruction going on now. That's the place you could turn in this country if you wanted to have sources of embryo-derived stem cells for research. I think the case can be made that it's ethical to proceed in this area. I think the case can be made that we should proceed in this area. And even if I haven't persuaded you today, which I find impossible, but even if I didn't, that this isn't morally defensible, you still face the question. If a cure took place in China or India or Britain or Sweden or Israel or Singapore or even Korea, would we prohibit people here from getting cures made from embryonic stem cells? I don't think we would. And so the moral question then becomes, what's the level of opposition? Don't do the research here, but take somebody else's research. If their hands are dirty, we'll take it as long as they do it, but we don't do it here. Or are there sources, or are there moral thinking that would say, look, if you have somebody in a wheelchair and you think you could grow new spinal cord cells for them, it would be morally impossible to deny them the opportunity, even if the cells came from stem cell lines that were derived from frozen embryos or cloned embryos. Keep in mind, too, as a last thought, I don't believe that human embryos are people. I do believe that we make them and destroy them as part of what goes on in infertility treatment. I'm not sure what to call cloned human embryos. They've turned out to be very hard to make. The only people who said that, the only team that said they made them turned out to be fraudulent. So it may not be easy to do, and even if you do make them, are they potential people at all? I don't know. They may not turn into adult human beings. The most you may get out of them is totipotent stem cell lines. So there may not be even a moral case there that you're destroying potentiality. We don't know if we're clonable. If we're not, then that may be the first place to go, cloning for stem cells if you're worried about the moral status of embryos. So let me stop there and just open it up for questions. If you have a question that you want to make, I think David can.
Right, if you can come down here, actually, we'll have you go to the mic, that way we can hear you. So if you have a question. One thing that I was going to raise is the fact that the report previous father Demetrius, who was the person who gave testimony to the President's Commission on Bioethics, I believe what he was trying to offer was a utilitarian way out, but still stay within his religious precepts. And he was troubled because he did not want to go ahead and concede the fact that embryos don't have values, and at the same time, these cell lines have already been created, so therefore they have been destroyed as embryos. So without saying I will allow this to happen in the future, we will allow what has already happened in the past. Now, a person could also strictly say, well, we should go ahead and stop all of it, destroy all of it, and don't allow it in the future. But he was trying to craft a way. He seemed fairly proud of himself, actually, that he'd come up with this utilitarian solution. And so one could also easily then extend that, though, to 400,000 and say, gee, well, if you're also going to be throwing away 400,000 embryos, then we ought to figure out how to do that.
That's my little prideful answer, too. So, like Father Demetrius, I think there is something to be said for taking advantage of the destruction of embryos, and President Bush understood it, too. I mean, he bought the argument that, okay, if they're already, the cell lines are here, it's true they came from embryos, but I can ignore that because the cell lines are here, so go use them. So my argument partly becomes, and there are frozen embryos, and they're being destroyed, some of them every day, then why aren't we using those in research? And we're not making new ones. We could argue about whether it's ethical to make embryos only to destroy them. That might be disrespectful, not because they're people, it just may be disrespectful to human reproduction or set the wrong attitude about respect for the creation of potential life. It doesn't matter. You don't have to go there. It seems to me, if you have a situation where you've got the embryos, you're adding to the supply every day, some couples would donate them. I'm not sure what the argument is if you're going to allow them to be destroyed at the infertility clinic, not to allow them to be used in the course of research. So it seems to me, if you overvalue too much the status of the embryo, that's a mistake. Call it a person. If you don't take advantage of what's already existed, the president's position becomes incoherent.
I think what the good father was trying to do also is to craft something which was politically expedient. So that, and this is part of the politics part of your talk, in that he was trying to come up with a way where conservative forces who were very much against any use of embryos, you know, they were also against for both, and that there was going to be a means by which to go ahead and use some of them. And the thing that does strike me in the political debate of this is there's some very prominent conservative people in Congress who have a variety of relatives or have strong or are strong proponents of stem cell line use, and you know what I'm thinking of. And it's fascinating because they'll say that they are radically conservative,
pro-lifers.
However, they will say, however, this is a good idea, and let me tell you why. This will save a lot of lives in the future. And all of a sudden they put on a utilitarian.
So the other argument that David is alluding to, which is interesting, is in the politics of the United States. Orrin Hatch, Gordon Smith, a senator from Oregon, Strom Thurmond before he died, although we can argue about whether he knew what he was doing before he died, but it was getting a little out there. But there were a number of pro-lifers who said, I have diabetes or personal acquaintance with disease and disability in my family or my life, and I would like to see this research proceed. If it is true that you're not going to specially create embryos and destroy them, I can support and tolerate this. So politically, some conservatives have bought the argument that if we're talking about possible or potential life being traded off against the real needs of real people in wheelchairs or people who are suffering through trying to manage diabetes, that's a trade they could make. I actually buy that utilitarian argument myself. And it has been effective. That's why, even in some of these states, there has been majority support to enact the ballot initiative in California. I think it was 60-40. And I think there are some in the pro-life area who normally ally themselves with the embryos have to be inviolate, who breaking ranks on the research issue. Turns out that polling Americans a minority believe in the embryo as a person from the moment of conception position. And there is room there perhaps to say, look, we have these embryos that we're going to destroy at the IVF clinic just because no one wants them, and there they sit, or they looked a little weird when we took them out. And I think you could build a consensus position there toward allowing that source. You know, ironically, that was what I thought George Bush was going to go for initially, and that is what happened in Canada, Australia, and the other countries that have the modified policies to allow it. We're probably the only scientifically advanced country that has the total ban approach. Even Spain, even up on my chart, Brazil, even Greece, some relatively conservative countries, Catholic countries are tolerating some forms of stem cell research just on this line of thinking. So that's been interesting to watch.
Other questions, please? I'll play for Bob.
Thanks. I would like to have you say a little bit more about the appeal to moral intuitionism in your argument. You know, I can see the merits of showing that we as a society have a different value system for the possible potential versus the actual. But, you know, moral intuitionism, as you know, is a suspect sort of theory, and, you know, in the best of all worlds, but it seems to me we want people to not just rely on intuition, but to step back and think about that. And then if conservative people do, then they might say, well, you caught me, and my intuition would say, yes, of course we prefer and value slightly more the actual human beings, but on reflection, really all life, human life is equal. So it seems to me that's a weakness in the argument.
So I would make this argument. I'm actually trying to crack a certain type of moral intuitionism with a counter-argument, just like you made.
Can you read some of her, because you're on the audio video.
Oh, you couldn't hear her question?
No, you won't. Oh, you can? Yeah. Okay. No, I meant for the webcast part.
Oh, for the webcast part. Okay. Nancy's point was that she never heard a talk that was that insightful.
Scrub this part.
That's just for the tape. So the question is, isn't it a kind of contingent argument to appeal to intuitions as a way to expand people's attitudes about embryos, trying to drive a wedge between potential and actual? What if they say, yeah, it sounds good, but think about it more and say, well, at the end of the day, still, even potential human life is deserving of respect and we shouldn't destroy it. So I think my response to that is two parts. One, I'm trying to, if you will, move the intuition that all human life is worthy of the same type of moral respect, which I think is a form of intuitionism, and say, but wait a minute now, think about this further. Deliberate more. You have potential. You have a lot of lost embryos. There are a lot of facts out there that would make you think that maybe not every embryo is morally equivalent. So even though your intuition, and I don't want to be disrespectful of the intuition. There's something very noble about respect life. I get the nobility of the drive there, not to destroy human life, is a good ethos. The question is, but is that a falsely grounded intuition, because in fact embryos are more complicated than that. So I'm using intuitionism to fight a certain type of narrow intuitionism. And then at the end of the day, that isn't really my argument. I didn't really appeal to intuition. I said, look, isn't it the case that we're tolerating embryo destruction anyway? So why don't you come on board and say, so I'm trying to drive a wedge, because if I can't break the idea that embryos are people, or we can never destroy them, then I guess the conclusion is, well, let's just shut the infertility clinic and be done with it. But it isn't quite intuitively obvious that they are people. And when you think about it further, I think you are forced to then say, well, then I want to respect potential life. All right, if you take that intuition, you have problems with, what about random sperm, and what about, you get over to the, why don't I respect every body cell? It might be a person. If I could only get it near an embryo and clone it, I could have more of me, and I can't take a shower anymore. And you start to get to problems if it's potential that you want to respect. So I'll take, partly true, but the nub of the core of the thing is that if you accept embryo loss in the service of certain goals, then this may be a goal that you want to accept the loss. And I think it makes sense to say this is a loss we can accept. Those embryos are doomed. If they're going to get destroyed, use them in research.
Next question.
Well, let's carry that one step further. I agree with you that I don't know anybody who's politically looking to vote against in vitro fertilization, but there certainly are philosophers who've written against it. Would argue, and in fact, Alfonso has argued against some of those lines of argument. You don't really have to worry about the potentiality of sperm and so on. To argue for a strong position of respect for embryos. So I think that Domizil will be willing to tackle the first half of your if statement, if we're willing to accept this, and say no. Is there a response to that line of argument? And agree, that wasn't the point of this talk, but how would you respond to that?
The question here is, there are people who would say, all right, I'll follow my logic where it leads, and if you tell me that there's a lot of embryo destruction going on in the way we do in vitro fertilization, then that makes me nervous, and maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Even though that is a very rapid road to being an ex-politician, it might be a coherent moral position that somebody might want to defend. I mean, it's really hard to go after IVF as not pro-life. Very tough. I mean, I'd love to be marching under that banner in debates. But you still might say, look, the question now is, you have to sort of get to the real issue of what purpose would justify the ending of potential. I've moved the argument over to one of potentiality, that concession I've got. So if that's what we're really talking about here, then what types of trade-offs would you accept? And if you try to take the line never, none, not ever, you could take it, but I think it's an absolutism that isn't in fact persuasive on the merits, because making new life is. I mean, I think that it's now we're over to, I gotta break omelets to make new life. That's part of nature. That's how it works anyway. Isn't that true? Okay, they concede that. So now the argument becomes, I don't think you should deliberately set out in a lab to artificially create potential, because it's not worth it for the purpose of making babies. Because as I said, we do it in the bedroom, we have embryo loss, which they don't want. I mean, that far even Leon Cass won't go. So let's say that it's wrong to do it under, but now I've got the argument as to this. I can't do it in a lab to sacrifice potential life in order in the name of either saving lives, the wheelchair case or the poor, or making new lives. I don't have much more to say than that, but I'll take it on those terms and say, all right, now it seems to me on reflection that's still an argument that's going to persuade more people that it's worth doing. And that's how I do. I think that's as far as you can go. There may be holdouts, but I don't think on that case they're going to win the day, so to speak.
Any other questions? Yes.
What I'll do is I'll take this question, and then if you wanted to ask me something a little more privately, you didn't want to stand up and say it, I'll just let you come up, because I know some of you can't believe you'd want to be somewhere else other than here, but some of you may want to go elsewhere. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask you your opinion if you think that, we get to the end of the, we get some cures with this, if it's going to be like in vitro, if it's going to be something that insurance covers, you're going to have such a price tag that medically it's going to
Well, it's a great question, the issue of who will have access if we got to anything that cured anybody, just in the interest of not being accused of hype. I don't know that we will. It's research. I don't know. But if you did, and you could really get to, let's use the spinal cord example, growing cells that really would go in, occupy the right function, stay there, and regenerate legitimate spinal cord activity, I do worry about it only being available to the rich. It's obviously not a problem that's unique to stem cell therapies. It's a problem of drugs, the prescription drug plan that's out there that's floundering around, or 40 million uninsured people. When I went to California, I did say, testifying in front of their legislature when they were thinking about the implementation of their pro-stem cell research thing, that they ought to think right now, if the citizens of California are going to be putting up money for bond issues, what could they do to guarantee fair access to the fruits of the results of anything? And the response was, well, we'll just do what we do normally. We have tech transfer policies. We have BIDOL. We know how to do that. And I consider that not a very good answer, because that answer is the market will drive access, is what it is. So I do think if you're going to go for public funding of early research in this way, and I believe this a little bit about even NIH-sponsored research, that we should be asking that question a little bit more. How can you guarantee fairer access to publicly funded research You know, the policy for a long time has been hand it to the private sector and they'll drive it out there faster and the incentives will give more access. But that hasn't been working right, and I think it wouldn't work right here either necessarily. So it is a good question to argue about. Some of it involves economists, not a group I want to be talking with, but others of you may be brave and want to go down that road. That was just a little anti-economist joke there. So let me thank you for your patience. As I said, I'll just come down here, and if anybody wants to chat a little bit more, please feel free, but you were very nice to stay so long.
Thank you very much.